Muy buenos días, queridos amigos del Instituto Juan de Mariana, a todos los que nos estáis viendo a través del canal de YouTube del Think Tank. Muchas gracias por apoyar todas las actividades de divulgación que hace esta institución. Actividades como el Free Market Roadshow, que es el motivo por el cual nos visitan expertos de primer nivel en distintas ciudades de España, en esta ocasión en Madrid, obviamente, con la organización del Instituto Juan de Mariana y la colaboración también del Think Tank Civismo. Y está con nosotros, como pueden ver, un invitado de primerísima fila como es Dan Mitchell. Vamos a hacer la entrevista en inglés, o sea que I'll just jump all over to English and welcome, Dan. Great to have you here. Not the first time in Madrid.
Not the first time, no.
Enjoying yourself?
So far, it's been great.
Looking forward to going back to the US of Biden, or how is this free market region treating you?
Joe Biden is very pro-big government. He's like Bernie Sanders, but on the installment plan. Mm-hmm. We're going in the wrong direction under Bernie. We would go into the wrong direction with Bernie at like 100 kilometers an hour. With Biden, we go in the wrong direction at 50 kilometers an hour.
So at least his low energy does have some positive attributes, I'm guessing.
Yes, I'm thankful he's not as young and vigorous as he used to be.
Yes, well, indeed. Let's get to more serious stuff. Tax competition is an issue here in Spain. The national government wants to limit the ability of regions to set their own taxes. This is laid out on the constitution and some of the basic laws of the land. So in legal terms, it's kind of an atrocity. But besides that, let's talk about fundamentals of taxation. Isn't it better to just have each institution, each region be able to set its own taxes and let people and agents play it out and see what happens?
Tax competition, or sometimes people just call it federalism or decentralization, I think it's very important for two reasons. First, it lets people choose the type of system that they want. Some people want a government doing lots of things, providing lots of services, and they're willing to pay high taxes. Well, let them have a region or a local government that does that for them. Most people, I think, probably want to keep more of their money, so they would want a low tax jurisdiction where they have greater control over spending their own money rather than expecting the government to do things for them. So simply allowing consumer choice is a benefit of tax competition. But as a fiscal economist, I like tax competition because it sort of puts handcuffs on politicians. That there's a natural tendency of governments to overtax and overspend. They can't help themselves. It's like locusts descending upon a farm and just eating up everything. So if you have tax competition and the politicians are afraid that if they raise taxes too high, that people will simply vote with their feet and move someplace else, that's a very important restraint on the greed of the political class.
Mm-hmm. The same restraint that competition has on companies, for example. You cannot exert monopoly powers if you're facing other competitors. Same thing for institutions, I'm guessing. So let's talk about the more extreme cases here of tax competition at the national level, at the international level. You know, that's where all the debate is at right now. Europe wants to move forward. Brussels wants to push forward with a minimum tax rate, which is also supported by the OECD. Now, you've written extensively about the OECD's drive towards big government and higher taxes. Can you walk us through the big mistake that is this idea of having a global minimum corporate tax rate?
Yeah, the politicians from many nations are upset that there are low tax jurisdictions. For instance, in Europe, some people say, oh, it's unfair that Ireland has a low tax rate, or that taxes on companies are low in Switzerland, or heaven forbid, we have places like Bermuda and the Cayman Islands with zero income tax. And so they've been pushing for a long time this idea that everyone should be forced to have high tax rates. Well, unfortunately, once Biden got in the White House, and then you have mostly left of center governments in the major countries around the world, they decided, okay, this is the time. Let's put in place a system where every country has to have a minimum tax rate of 15% on companies. And of course, you'll have bureaucrats at the OECD and elsewhere writing rules to define what taxable income is. And once that gets in, and this is what worries me, even more than the 15% proposal that we're talking about, once that precedent is established, that international bureaucrats and politicians can set tax rates, well, two things are going to happen. That 15% rate is going to go up, and then the politicians are going to say, hey, this was so much fun. Let's do the same thing for personal income tax. for capital gains tax. They won't stop because politicians, they're looking at demographic decline. In many of our nations, people are living longer and having fewer children. And the welfare states, which were already unaffordable, are going to become fiscal catastrophes. And so the politicians, rather than reform the programs and make them more rational, they're saying, let's figure out new ways to just squeeze more money out of our taxpayers. And in the long run, that's just a recipe for countries becoming Greece and collapsing.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, it gets ugly as all of these policies get implemented. Now, you made a comment of the Cayman Islands. Now, you've always supported the idea that tax havens play a role in the international economy, that it should not be punished, but it should rather not just be tolerated, even celebrated. Why? Why is that?
Well, there are several reasons why so-called tax havens are good for the global economy. First, let's just look back at economic history. When did the Western world become rich? When did Western Europe and North America become prosperous? In the 1800s and early 1900s, before we had any income tax, before there was any welfare state. Now, once we became rich nations, the politicians figured out how they could sort of extract some of the money, and they set up income taxes and welfare states. But we became rich because we had no income tax and small government. And now the OECD and other bureaucracies are saying, well, other nations elsewhere in the world, they can't use that same very successful development strategy. So I think that's wrong on that level. But then looking specifically at the idea of a so-called tax haven, what does that actually mean technically? A tax haven is a jurisdiction that has zero taxes or very low taxes, and they defend their fiscal sovereignty over the taxation of economic activity inside their borders. And that means that if you're historically at least, not anymore unfortunately, but historically it meant that if you set up a bank account in Switzerland, the Swiss banks were under no obligation to obey, say, French tax law. Well, that of course upsets French politicians because they know that, we're going to overtax people, but they're going to move their money to Switzerland. And so eventually Switzerland and all these other places around the world were forced to eliminate their human rights laws regarding financial privacy. They had to surrender their fiscal sovereignty because you had big countries like the US and Germany and France basically threatening them with financial protectionism. So it really was an odious, reprehensible chapter in global international economic history, because now that these tax havens have been substantially weakened, what's happening? Politicians are increasing tax rates, exactly what the theory would tell us. So if you want a world where politicians have more power and more ability to raise taxes, then yes, shut down tax havens. But if you want a world where people have some individual protection for their assets, some ability to maintain capital in the private sector rather than getting it diverted to government, you want tax havens if you want these good economic outcomes, because in a world without tax havens, higher taxes, higher taxes, higher taxes.
We've had a little spat over some YouTubers, like they call them here in Spain, which is basically streaming superstars of the internet, moving from Spain to Andorra, which, as you know, is a lower tax. Sometimes people could consider that to be a tax haven located in between Spain and France. But what's really telling here is that the younger people, the people who follow them and who watch them, these videos online and stream their video game matches online, all of these things they do. The younger audiences, they support them. They think they're doing the right thing. They think the normal attitude is to actually get out and do not get more than half of your income taxed away. And today there's a poll coming out in one of the main newspapers in Spain as we are recording this, saying that 3 out of 4 Spaniards want lower taxes, not just for the rich or the poor, but just all across the board. So this message does seem to resonate to a certain extent. People are fed up.
And they should be fed up. Politicians, governments, bureaucracies, that they waste money. It's basically, it's a scam where government takes money out of our left pockets, then a lot of it spills through their fingers and they put some of it back in our right pocket. And we're supposed to be grateful. Oh, the government took 100 euros from me yesterday, but they're giving me back 50 euros today. You're not winning, you're losing. Now, of course, there are some interest groups and special friends of politicians who wind up getting more than they pay. So you can see why there's political pressure to make government bigger. But in the long run, the only people who win this game are the interest groups, the politicians, and the bureaucrats. So I applaud workers, entrepreneurs, investors who are able to organize their affairs in ways that minimize their taxes, because that's not only good for them, it's good for the private economy. And if it's good for the private economy, that means it's good for the rest of us. Every time I see one of these stories where, oh, isn't it unfair that Starbucks or Google or someone is paying low taxes because they have a subsidiary in Bermuda or the Cayman Islands, I applaud, because that's keeping capital in the productive sector of the economy out of the hands of politicians. And that means that I'm going to have a better living standard over time, because there's going to be more economic growth.
There's one thing going on here as well, which is the talk around the wealth tax, which you may probably know this. We're the only EU country that still levies old school fashioned wealth tax. Now, there's some things going on in the Netherlands and some elements in France, and out of the EU, Norway has one, and Switzerland, which is very low tax, does have a little wealth tax. But Spain, there is a lot of discussion of not just keeping this wealth tax, but actually multiplying it to even by 10 in some proposals. So we are alone at this. But there is a lot of rhetoric about bringing this tax back in other countries. You know, Thomas Piketty and other authors have art for it. Why do we need a wealth tax? Do we need a wealth tax?
A wealth tax is one of the most destructive and harmful things for an economy. What people don't understand, and this might sound like boring economics, but the way to think of a wealth tax, it's a tax on your return to your savings and investment. So if you have a wealth tax, even a very low wealth tax of 2%, well, maybe your investments are going up by 5% a year. Well, a 2% wealth tax means that's a 40% effective tax rate on your investment. And that's just from the wealth tax. Keep in mind, governments are also levying the regular income tax, dividend taxes, capital gains taxes, and things like that. So you can very easily, especially in years where the economy is not doing well, your wealth tax can be over 100% effective tax rate on income that is saved and invested. Now, I'm a believer in supply and demand curves. I'm a believer that incentives matter. If every time I turn left, somebody hits me on the head with a club, I'm going to start turning right.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. They do experiments with earthworms where they shock them if they go one way in a tube, and they don't shock them. They go. Even earthworms learn to avoid pain. Well, if the government is imposing fiscal pain with these high and extortionary tax rates, what are people going to do? They're either going to move or they're going to save and invest less. And if they save and invest less, who gets hurt? Well, it's not good for them, but it's not good for you and me and every worker out there who needs a vibrant private economy with private capital and private investment to create better jobs.
Dan, which countries are getting it right, or at least which countries are doing the least damage in terms of fiscal policy right now? Because we get bad news all over the place, but there's some areas, some countries, some nations that do seem to be getting some of these ideas put and passed through policy.
Well, I think the way to answer it is which countries are getting it least wrong, because there's no perfect libertarian paradise country around the world. Even very low tax places like Bermuda, Singapore, Hong Kong, Cayman Islands, I mean, they still have policies that I wouldn't like. But in some sense, we're measuring all these countries, 200 plus jurisdictions around the world. Some are very bad, and as you point out, some are less bad. And in Europe, I think Switzerland is really a great case study, because not only is the overall fiscal burden reasonably low, but they also have a very decentralized system, with most of the government authority being exercised at the canton and municipal level. So yes, there are some central government taxes, but they're very low. There is some central government spending, but it's comparatively modest. Most government takes place at the canton and municipal level, and they compete with each other very vigorously. And that means that what do you get? Low fiscal burdens, but also pressure for governments to do a better job, a more efficient job at providing sort of core public goods that people might actually value. So, I'm a libertarian. I might fantasize, oh, well, we should have, privatized schools and privatized hospitals and stuff like that. But if you're going to have government do these things, at least do it efficiently in a decentralized system, because as a taxpayer, you wind up getting more value for your money. And so I think Switzerland, because of the just really dramatic decentralization they have, that's a model. And I know that Spain has some level of federalism, but you'd be so much better off if you copied Switzerland and more power was taken out of the central government and put down to the different provinces.
And I was just thinking that's such a classic model, the Swiss model, because some people would go and quote the Baltic states, which have been doing some interesting stuff with taxes. But this kind of reminds us that it's important to actually put the policies in place, but then keep them in place. And I'm guessing that's the secret of Switzerland's success. It's not just that the policies are good. Maybe some of the Baltic countries get it even better. The whole thing in Estonia, in which you only pay corporation tax if you actually distribute the profits, seems like even better than the arrangement in the corporation tax in Switzerland. But the thing here is that Switzerland has had this system in place of low taxes and economic freedom for so long that it starts to yield results, which is similar to what we see here at the regional level in Madrid. Madrid has had free market policies for 20 years. The results do not come in from overnight. You need some time. You need to keep them in place, show that these incentives are going to stick. And once they do, then you start seeing the results.
I'm a big fan of the Baltic countries, especially Estonia, but Lithuania and Latvia, they've both done a good job. They are the superstars of the former Soviet Empire. There's no question they've done some really good things. The low flat tax in Estonia, both Estonia and Latvia have no double taxation of capital income. So there's basically... You in an ideal world, you either tax corporate income once at the corporate level or once when it's distributed as dividends to shareholders. But don't tax it twice, which is the mistake we make in the United States and most other countries make to varying degrees. So I'm a fan of the Baltic countries, but will they still be good in 30 years and 50 years? I admire Switzerland because they have kept their system so strong for so long. And by the way, this is where I should confess something. The United States used to be like Switzerland. We had a very decentralized system for a long time with 75% of government at the state and local level. And of course, overall government was much smaller in the past. Well, now state and local governments have basically stayed the same size, gotten a little bit bigger, but the central government in Washington has exploded in size. So now 70% of government in the United States is at the central level, when it used to be the other way around. Most of it was at the state and local level. So unlike Switzerland, we have sort of frittered away and sacrificed our heritage of having a decentralized system with state and local governments playing the dominant role. And I think that's very unfortunate. And that's one of the reasons I admire Switzerland so much, is they do have that system seems incredibly durable and strong. And by the way, it's not all economics. You have a country with Italian-speaking regions, German-speaking regions, French-speaking regions, and even some region where they speak Romanish, whatever that is, I don't even know. But they're all very peaceful. And the fact that there are Catholics and Protestants, nobody fights. There's no disagreement in Switzerland because they all know that they get to make their own rules for themselves at the local level, and governments are constrained by competition between the cantons and municipalities. So there's a lesson to be learned, not just about good economic policy, but also about good social policy, harmony, tranquility with people of different backgrounds, religions, you name it.
There's one point that I hear more and more from business people especially, is that even worse than taxes is excessive regulation, over-regulation, hyper-regulation. What's your take on that? The issue of regulation, which wasn't that much of a problem back in the day, because the volume of requirements was not as high as it is today, but it accumulates over time. So the stock of things that you have to comply with, the requirements, the restrictions, it gets worse and worse. What's your take on that? The importance of combining the good tax policy with deregulation. And I'm just throwing this out. Maybe it's even harder to deregulate than to cut taxes.
I think regulation is a more difficult issue because it's so many things. It's everything from occupational licensing laws to business permitting to health and safety regulations. there's such a wide range of regulations. And the way I look at it is, imagine you're a runner and you have a flat road. That's easy to run on. But what if all of a sudden there's an obstacle course and you have to climb a wall, you have to jump a moat? That's what regulation is like. It creates an obstacle course for entrepreneurs who are simply trying to serve the needs of consumers and behave in an efficient manner. Well, all of a sudden, if you have to detour here and jump here and stop here, it makes it much more expensive to operate a business, which means, of course, what happens? You have higher costs for consumers. You can afford to hire fewer workers. And because it's not like there's one light switch. With taxes, you turn the light switch, it goes either up or down. Well, I guess a dimmer switch would be a better analogy. You either make the taxes higher or lower. With regulation, it's like a giant control panel because you have all these different regulations, some specific to a certain sector, some dealing with different parts of the economy. And so it's almost like you have to be this sort of rocket scientist, lever here, button here, dial here, and turn these things. But the bottom line is, you're right. Regulation, in many ways, can be more of an impediment to creating jobs and operating a business than even taxes. Because a lot of times with taxes, politicians wind up giving loopholes to their different interest groups. And so maybe you can find some way to lower your tax by being a friend of a politician. With regulation, I guess they can give you a carve out of the regulation. But even that winds up becoming an expensive hassle. You have to hire lawyers and accountants and monitors and compliance officers. And so government really does make everything so much more difficult and more expensive. And again, I'm not saying that because we should cry about, those poor CEOs and those poor rich stockholders. We should be upset about it because it's ordinary people, workers and consumers who ultimately bear the cost of all these expensive policies.
I guess that's sometimes one of the reasons why public debate on economics is very poor, because we don't think of how do these costs get passed on to regular people. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? I mean, the incidence at the end of taxation, regulation, it falls up on the consumer, on the worker, on just your average Joe, not just, big corporations. They don't pay it, they pass it on.
Oh, we're having this debate in the United States. Joe Biden wants to push the corporate tax rate in the United States at the central government level from 21% up to 28%. And he says, that's just a tax on business. No, it isn't. Corporations collect taxes, they don't pay taxes. The people who pay the taxes are the shareholders of the company, the workers of the company, and the consumers who buy the company's products. Now, if you ask 5 economists, how should you allocate the corporate tax among those different groups? You'll probably get 7 different answers. And all of those answers might be right because it might depend on which business faces international competition, which business has different characteristics. But the one reality that we all know for sure is that somehow, some way, individuals pay when business taxes go up. And most of the research seems to indicate that workers pay a minimum of 50% of the corporate tax in the form of lower wages and, of course, in some cases, fewer jobs.
Mm-hmm. Another point I wanted to make, let me tell you a little story. We have a deficit at the national level, at the regional level as well. Most regions are in deficit, but at the local level, we've been running surplus after surplus for a while. The secret behind that is a thing you've written a lot about. I'm sure you probably don't know about the specifics of the local government in Spain, but we have a debt brake, just like Switzerland and other countries do, which is basically one of the main topics that you've always put forward when you write about government spending. That since cutting government spending seems to be so hard, at least make sure that the growth of government spending is slowed down and you let the economy take over. That allows you to reduce the relative size of government and it allows you to balance the budget without the dramatic cuts that probably should be done and could be done without losing efficiencies, actually increasing them, but politicians don't want to do it. And it's very telling that in Spain, the only compliant administrations with this debt brake are the ones that are in a surplus and have been for a while.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Switzerland's debt brake, which is really a spending cap. It's a formula dealing with 5-year averages, but let's strip away all the confusing stuff. In the real world, what the Swiss debt brake basically does is it tells government it can grow at 2% a year. Now, 2% a year, if you're a libertarian, you might want to cut it 5% a year. So 2% a year, oh, that sounds like you're letting government grow. But as you said in your question, if the private economy is growing a little bit faster and the government's growing 2% a year, over time you are shrinking the relative burden of government spending. But as a practical matter, what makes the Swiss debt brake, and by the way, we have a state in the United States, Colorado, they have something called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which also has a spending cap like in Switzerland. What these systems do is they tell politicians, if there's a recession and your revenues suddenly fall by 5 or 10%, you can still increase government spending 2% a year. So you're not forced to cut spending in a recession. But the key thing that makes these things work, if you actually look at the research that, why do these spending caps work? The key thing is that when the economy is growing during the boom years, when revenues might be growing 10%, you can still increase spending 2% a year. And then all of a sudden, all that extra revenue is available to reduce debt and in many cases to cut taxes. So you wind up creating this virtuous cycle of fiscal responsibility, leading to surpluses, leading to tax cuts, leading to lower debt. And then you have more fiscal responsibility with government only growing about 2% a year. It works. Balanced budget requirements in the states and the different 50 states in the US don't work. The Maastricht criteria here in Europe doesn't work. It's a joke. Okay, you're only supposed to have 60% of GDP in debt and 3% of GDP in deficits. Obviously, that gets blown out of the water every time there's an economic downturn. A spending cap is successful because it's very easy to enforce. It's very transparent. Now, obviously, if you adopt one and some politician just says, oh, we're going to change the law, let's say you have a bunch of left-wing parties get control of government, I suppose they could change the law. In Switzerland, it's a constitutional provision, so they can't do that. But spending caps are the way to go. There's no question in the real world, they're the only policy that works.
Is that a lesson for libertarians? Because very often we position ourselves in utopian scenarios, and then when we actually try to make it a bit more pragmatic, which is a case of this type of debt breaks or spending caps, they actually work and they yield the type of results that we're looking for, because you may think that's compromising principles, allowing for certain ideas that are not, in theory, the best, but the countries that do, they actually get the best results that we're looking for.
Like most libertarians, I can fantasize about a government that only consumes 5% of the economy. I can fantasize about a government where it only does national defense and a few core public goods like a legal system. But the reality is we have these big bloated welfare states now, and because of demographics and because these welfare state laws, these entitlements as we call them in the United States, because they're so poorly designed, the trajectory is for government to be growing like minimum 5 or 6% a year. So if you're a libertarian, you might fantasize about this world with a tiny government like we had in the United States, for instance, after our Constitution was created. But in the real world today, we have this monstrosity. And if we can simply take that government spending from 6% growth a year down to 2% growth a year, and the private sector is maybe growing nominally 4 or 5% a year, over time, that's a huge victory. Now, is it my fantasy victory? No. But is it a real, tangible achievement that leaves more resources in the private sector, creates more prosperity for ordinary people? Of course it is. So my view is, as a libertarian, yes, I'm willing to fantasize. And if someone wants to have me give a speech about the ideal libertarian society, I'll bore them with an hour-long speech on that topic. But in the real world of politicians and governments, I'll take incremental victories, especially if they're incremental victories like a spending cap that have such a strong track record of delivering results.
Yeah, the other side gets incremental victories.
Well, they get them all the time, and that's what's created the mess we're in today.
That's why we have to fight them at their own game. Yeah, indeed. You've written, Emmanuel Rand has as well, and you've collaborated with him through the years, about the optimal size of government, which is something that not a lot of authors have actually touched on. Vito Tanzi's writings on this topic are interesting. Alberto Alesina, God bless him, passed away a while ago. He also devoted some of his writings to this. The Italian school, Carlo Favero, Silvia Ardagna, but all in all, there's not that many economists that have focused on this. What's the optimal size of government according to evidence? What does this RAND curve tell us? And what sort of levels are we talking here?
The RAND curve, for people who aren't familiar with it, it's sort of the spending version of a Laffer curve. Mm-hmm. The Laffer curve says if you have zero tax rate, you get no money, but if you have 100% tax rate, you get no money. And so there's a curve where you maximize revenue. Now, of course, I don't want to maximize revenue. I want to maximize growth. So I still want tax rates to be low. But the RAND curve basically says at zero government, if you have anarchy with no rule of law and nothing but bandits and, you're going to have very little economic activity. It's going to be a catastrophe. Now, I know some of our anarcho-capitalist friends say private institutions will develop, but let's set that theoretical debate aside. So if you have no government, no rule of law, chaos, very little economic growth, but if you have a giant welfare state and high taxes, very little growth. So somewhere between no government and giant government is a growth maximizing size of government. That's called the RAND curve. Well, the academic researchers who look at this generally find that a government consuming about 20% of GDP is growth maximizing. And when you think, well, what does that mean, 20% of GDP?
That's half of what we have here.
Yeah, well,
just for our audience too.
Yeah, so in France and Denmark, governments might consume 50% of GDP. In Spain, 40%. The U.S., 35%. But the point is, we're all way above 20% of GDP. But having said that, I think that academic research is wrong. Because right now, if you set out as an academic to do a study on what's the growth maximizing size of government, when you look at the data out there in modern times, you'll see that Hong Kong and Singapore and a few places like that have governments spending about 20% of GDP. And then you have, Switzerland and Australia and the US maybe at low 30s, Spain at 40, and, as we said, Denmark and France at 50. Well, when you look at the growth rates, you're going to say, oh, look, Hong Kong and Singapore grow faster. And then Australia and Switzerland grow this fast. And then down here is like France and Italy with no growth. And you're going to say, well, that means that growth is maximized when government is 20% of GDP. But where's the data for countries where governments only spend 10% of GDP?
We're missing another element of the comparison.
And in the modern world, there are no genuinely small government countries anymore. There used to be, in the 1800s and early 1900s, Western countries like the US, Great Britain, Germany, and so on, even France.
Sweden,
they were only spending 10% of GDP. So, and that was the period when these countries became rich. So I actually think that if we had modern era countries where governments were only spending 5 to 10% of GDP, we would find that the growth maximizing size of government was not 20% of GDP, it'd be way down at 10% of GDP or less. Now, in some sense, that's an academic debate, because as we already discussed, in Spain, governments are consuming 40% of GDP. Other countries even higher. And if the growth maximizing size is 20, there has to be a lot of fiscal retrenchment and reform and a very effective long-run spending cap to slowly bring government down to 20% of GDP. Now, once we get to that level, if we ever do, then people like me will say, we should keep going. Because the long-run historical evidence, going back to the 1800s, is that we'll get even more prosperity if government becomes even smaller. But that's like our debate about whether you're a theoretical libertarian or a practical libertarian with a spending cap. Who cares whether the growth maximizing size is 5% or 10% or 20%? Right now, we're 40% and it's getting bigger. So let's at least stop the bleeding. Let's deal with the fact that we're in crisis. Let's figure out some way to at least sort of turn the sort of leviathan of government back in the right direction so that it's slowly shrinking. And then if by some miracle we achieve that and government begins to slowly fall back down to 20% of GDP, then in that fantasy world where we've achieved this victory, then we can start debating amongst ourselves whether it should get even smaller.
Fair enough. You want to play some word association? Name association?
I guess so.
Okay, let's do that. Donald Trump.
Clown.
Joe Biden.
Well, Donald Trump was right. Sleepy.
Sleepy Joe. He did get that one right. Milton Friedman.
Hero.
Friedrich Hayek.
Great hero.
Arthur Laffer.
Warrior.
A warrior, like that. And Don Mitchell?
Don Quixote, because I constantly tilt at windmills and I never seem to achieve anything. Government keeps getting bigger. So I do worry my entire career. This isn't just a one-word answer, but I do worry my entire career. I've been fighting to try to keep government under control. And sometimes I actually get sad, like I'm not winning.
You are winning a lot of fights, more than you think, and just take notice of what's going on here, for example, in Madrid. These ideas of tax competition, lower taxes, they profit from the intellectual work of people like you. So thank you a lot for joining us here. You're always welcome here in Spain. And to everyone from our audience, para todo nuestro público, seguidores, simpatizantes, socios del Instituto Juan de Mariana, muchas gracias por seguir esta conversación. A los lectores del Libre Mercado, que también habrán leído probablemente estos días la transcripción de esta charla, pues muchas gracias por estar ahí. Y nada, nos vemos muy pronto, o sea que sigan atentos a todo el contenido disponible en las redes sociales, en el canal y en los eventos del Instituto Juan de Mariana. Thank you, Dan. Hasta luego.